This year, a record 32 million Latinos are projected to be eligible to vote, exceeding any other group of eligible voters. In simple terms, the Latinx community is the largest voting minority in the United States for the first time ever. This is momentous, but what does this mean? How will this impact the election, and what does it mean for voting Latinos across the country? Today, we'll explore those questions and more with our expert panelists, for whom we are all so grateful for joining us today. We have Gabriela Teissier, a journalist and news anchor at Univision 34 KMX TV, the #1 Spanish language television station in the nation. Aldrin Rafael Bonilla, the Executive Vice President of the Fund for the City of New York. Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at Pew Research Center. Bernardo Ruiz, a 2-time Emmy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker, and Joaquin Gonzalez, the Shirley Adelson Siegel Public Interest Fellow working on voting rights at the Texas Civil Rights Project, which is an incredible project that everyone should look into. So to start us off, I have a question for the entire panel, and you can jump in just as you please. A poll from the University of Houston and Univision found that 90% of Texas Latino voters, or Texas Latinos, will probably vote in the 2020 presidential election. These voters also perceive this upcoming election as highly consequential. 79% said it was more important to vote in 2020 than in the 2016 presidential election. Why do you think we're seeing higher Latino voter turnout and registration during the 2020 election? And what were some key differences between the 2016 and 2020 elections for Latinx voters that make this election more critical?
Who wants to start?
This is Mark. I can say I could jump in. Danielle, I wanted to confirm something. That's 90% among registered voters, correct? Who say they're going to turn out to vote, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've been seeing in our surveys of Pew Research very similar takes. But one of the things that I think is interesting that we've seen over the last 4 years among Latinos is a growing sense of unease about their place in the country. A growing share, particularly immigrants, but also the US-born Latinos, are telling us that they're worried about their place in the country, and they're concerned about things like the future for their children. So just those issues alone, to me, suggest that for many Latinos, that encapsulates many concerns, feelings, and worry about the future, not only for themselves, for their place in the country, but also how their children are going to do in the next generation.
And I think you should add to that the fact that we know now that every about 30 seconds you get one Latino or to somebody of Latino descent becoming 18 years or older. And that, of course, immediately grants you to vote. And if your parents came to this country and they were not eligible to vote, let me tell you, they're talking to you. They're telling you, guess what? You got to get out there and you got to get your voice be heard, because we don't have any voice in this country and we sure want to be participating.
I think also we can't underestimate the role that COVID has had in reigniting interest in politics and the disproportionate negative impact that COVID has had on the lives of Latino people and Latino communities. So for Latinos who face greater ever food insecurity, for Latinos who face themselves in terms of being risked as essential workers, here in New York City, not everybody has the luxury or the liberty of the opportunity to work from home. And when you go into public transportation, you just see hundreds and hundreds of Latinas, Latinos, Latinx making their way to their different jobs, either essential work or work deemed essential by their institutions. So I think that whether how they see their abuelita or abuelo being affected by COVID, how they see their children being affected by COVID, both whether they have to go to school or stay home, and the troubles or the difficulties of having proper childcare at home for their children if they have to be away, or also the fact that the disproportionate burden of essential work has been thrusted upon the Latino community to keep their various cities going, while everyone has the luxury to hunker down to varying degrees that Latinos don't have the ability to experience that.
I think also related to this idea about their place in American society, I think increasing sort of unprecedented attacks directly on their role in democracy and American life, with the census attempting to exclude immigrants for the first time ever from the census counts, and voter purges. In Texas here, we had one last year where they tried to unlawfully kick off about 100,000, almost all Latinx voters from the rolls. So I think that riles people up when they see that they're being attacked that way.
Absolutely. And just to repeat the question, since Bernardo was able to join us, sorry about that Zoom confusion. We were discussing why we are seeing higher Latino voter turnout and registration during the 2020 presidential election versus the 2016 election, and what are some key differences that make this election more critical?
Yeah, so I mean, just to, echo some of the points that have been said before, both about the kind of explicit attacks on the Latinx immigrant community, and of course, COVID, those are big issues. I mean, from my vantage point as a journalist and documentary filmmaker, a lot of the research is showing that there is going to be a historic turnout in terms of Latinx voters, but we still had to push public broadcasting to ensure that we'd be able to do a 1-hour special on what we believe is a kind of critical year in a historic election. So at the time, we didn't know that of course, the pandemic was going to happen, or that the mass mobilizations around police violence and racial justice would happen as well, which I think made this an even more critical year. So I think we've seen many different reasons that I don't know if this was addressed already. I think that one of the more interesting areas for us is the rise of the youth voter. So either first-time voters or younger voters, and in states like Texas, you're seeing really kind of innovative forms of organization to mobilize younger and first-time voters. So that was something that we were interested in for our documentary, Latino Vote Dispatches from the Battleground.
Great, thank you so much. Next, I have another question that really is for everyone, but maybe geared slightly more towards Gabriela and Bernardo. How do you suggest journalists and storytellers cover the importance of the Latino community's involvement and turnout in the upcoming election?
I'm going to start, Bernardo, or do you want to jump in?
Please, Gabriela.
So for us on a day-to-day basis, and the way that we at Univision are geared, we need to pay close attention to whatever is happening, because as Bernardo just pointed out, we're talking about very touchy subjects. We're talking about injustice, inequality, racial division. And because of the racial divide, you have to be very sensitive to all that is happening. So you cannot just go out there and barrage and just go in there into a neighborhood and say, okay, this is what's happening. You have to really take into account almost everybody. Times have changed a lot. And from the last coverage that we had of 2016 up until now, technology has changed a lot. And forget the technological part only. Think about the messaging that you do through technology. It's not the same anymore. This mass media idea is slowly but surely fading away. We're talking to individuals. So my suggestion to anybody who's doing any kind of coverage right now about elections, think about the individual. Don't think about the whole, because that was the old way of thinking. That was what we did. We did mass media communication. And now it's you and the viewer on a little screen. So think about the ways that you're portraying things, the way that you're relating things. If you're using any visuals, think about the right messaging. I think that we have a huge challenge because journalists like me that were born and raised in other countries in a different time, in a different era, and have seen this over and over again, this is the time, especially after COVID, where you see the change in that messaging. So I think that you need to completely turn around the way that you look at that coverage.
From my point of view, I think it's worth asking the question whether or not we should be even thinking about, the Latinos as a whole. I think increasingly we're seeing reporting driven by younger reporters that's pushing the envelope of these labels. It's certainly something we tried to do in our film to showcase the diversity, not just ethnic, racial, and country of origin, diversity of this broadly, categorized Latino population, but also the political diversity, which is something we try to get at in the film, regional political diversity. Pew has been a fantastic resource. And one kind of interesting element that we had in our film kind of picked up, I guess, Mark, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was in 2016 that Pew began doing research on folks who identify as Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latino. So, that's also something, obviously this is a long history within the Latino identity, but only, in recent memory has it begun getting public or national or broadcast attention, clearly long overdue. So I think, I'm excited by coverage of the Latino community and its political power that, is forward thinking and that also moves beyond just the elections. It's great that we do this. We all scramble to cover the elections every election cycle, but obviously the Latino story in the United States is an ongoing story. It's a part of the United States history from its founding and forward and even before, obviously. So I think thinking about it in these bigger, longer terms and not being scared of that, I think is something I'd like to see more of.
And Bernardo, to add another dimension in terms of diversity, that's something that we've been looking at the center for a while. We talk about origins, we talk about regional, we talk about political party identifications. There's also the story about immigrant and immigrant generations. The group of Latinos that are now growing among the fastest is actually third or higher generation Hispanics, because immigration from Latin America has really slowed. So when you're talking about Latino voters, about a third will be a third or higher generation, if not more, which means that their families have been in the country for a long time. Tend to be English speaking. They also tend to be sometimes more conservative or also more Republican leaning, and will be in places like, say, Texas or New Mexico or Arizona. But it's another emerging part of the Latino population story that I think highlights the growing diversity of the population in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in terms of storylines, in addition to the intergenerational dynamics that are happening, and also the Latinos' evolution in terms of identity and in terms of the racial categorizations in the United States, having, not fitting into the binary of black and white, but yet our experience is somewhat shaped by that. I would also add that there's a great deal of Latinos who are not eligible to vote and are yet being civically involved and having a greater influence in terms of shaping the politics of this country within the identity of being a non-voter and not being eligible to vote, equally as so as those individuals who are eligible to vote and are exercising that obligation or right. So I think this group of individuals and in some Latino communities, because of their volunteerism and because of their ingenuity and because of their activism, are really giving a new lifeblood to the politics within the community, magnifying beyond just the numbers of those eligible voters.
Thank you so much. Now let's hear from some other NAHJ board members. You can either raise your blue hand or just jump right in.
Okay, I guess I'll start. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you all for being here. This one is more to Aldrin Bonilla. And with your experience working during the census of 2000 to 2010 and this 2020, how have the demographics changed through these years, and how is this affecting or benefiting the Latinx political representation, specifically in the area of Washington Heights and Inwood, where you are more experienced to work in?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the census has loomed enormously important, right, in our community, and the whole census operation, the whole decennial has been challenged from the very beginning, from the inside, right, from the inside, from the executive branch, whether it's the citizenship question, whether it's now the issue of subtracting unauthorized or undocumented from the final number that's being delivered to the president and to Congress, that the courts have already rejected twice, but is sure to go to the Supreme Court. This is unfortunate because this is the quality and the accuracy of this decennial census, the 2020. This was going to be like a real coming of age for us, right? A coming out story in terms of even Texas, maybe Latinos being the largest among the minorities, or even the plurality. In New York City, the Latino community taking the plurality in terms of its population number. So like this was going to be that stamp of that good housekeeping stamp, or that stamp of data for us data geeks, like that data demographic approval. And that you would hope that as the data and the demography is more accurate, it pushes more on our being representative at numbers commensurate to who we are in terms of local, state, and federal, power. But that's been really challenged. This decennial, I'm afraid, the quality of the data and those who have to clean it has been jeopardized and threatened more than ever. And that's unfortunate, because these are the numbers that help make the case, not only for the resources that our community deserves and needs, but for the representation. In Washington Heights, Inwood, in Northern Manhattan, the census accuracy and the data completeness in 2000, 2010 really helped make the case for having a congressional district. For the first time, a Latino majority congressional district, which doesn't guarantee you'll get a Latino candidate as an outcome, but increases the likelihoods that when you draw the lines commensurate to the people within those areas, that you have an opportunity to elect a candidate of choice from the Latino community. And this was very much, something that folks felt really proud of. But then also there's this sense of being seen, right? And not being invisible, at least for that period of time. I can tell you briefly with the census, I've mentioned threats from within, right? Even from within our own executive branch. In terms of threats from without, when you think of what the Russian or other intervention in the midterm elections of 2018 did in terms of disinformation, there was a great fear that there was going to be a great opportunity to do disinformation around the census. And while there was some of that, like for example, I purchased about $400 worth of different domain names that I would think wouldn't be available. So I own agasecontar, nyc.com. I own census2020online.com. I own all these census URLs, and I purchased them for less than about $500. Third-party brokers were offering me over $55,000 for those URLs. And it's unsure whether these URLs would have gone into hands of individuals that were going to do disinformation. But subsequent, after April, May, there was such a good job from the federal government doing disinformation that many of these people who wanted to purchase these URLs from me, the value dropped precipitously, because there wasn't, in my opinion, by conjecture, I guess that the market or whoever wanted to do bad around the census from outside felt that we were doing such a good job making fear and anxiety and alienating people and disinformation and misinformation and making enemies of one another, and to not participate or not come out or not be civically involved in the census, that they felt, you know what, they're doing such a good job, tearing themselves apart. We really don't need to add to that. But that was the feeling I got. But I'm still very much concerned that as much as all the work we've tried to do to get a good census count, while the count might be complete in statistician or demographers terms, the census data itself is not going to be as accurate and as clean, unfortunately, as we would need it to be in 2020 to really reflect the huge numbers and the huge growth that we've exhibited in key cities and key states throughout this country.
Yeah. We over here in California, I mean, we have been sweating it. We have worked with everybody trying to get the people to get counted, to open up the, even at the last minute, I mean, to open up the door for that census counting people, volunteers out there, and they would still not open the door, would be like horrified and mortified. And as you point out, Rafael, of course, it's very, very hard because they change that date constantly. And even the day when everything was supposed to be over, my own co-anchor on Univision radio was confused. He was still saying, no, it's until tomorrow at 3 p.m. And I'm like, no, stop saying that. It's tonight. It's midnight. He kept on saying, no, but I just read it. And I'm like, where did you read it? We started getting emails coming from every supposed information source saying that California had already been 98% counted. And we knew from our own constituents, it had not been over 52, 40% in some cases. And they were stating that we had already counted. So of course, people that are reading this are thinking, well, everybody has been counted. And if I count or not, what else? So it was daunting. It was very hard. And we're hoping for the best, expecting the worst, unfortunately.
Bianca?
Yes, thank you very much for being here, first of all. And I wanted to know, because to many people, the idea that there is a significant Hispanic support for Republicans is something of a mystery. But actually in the past election, Trump won almost a third of the Latino vote. So I wanted to know, what do you expect will happen this year? Have things changed due to COVID?
This is Mark. Great question. I think there are a couple of interesting trends to note, and support for Trump overall among Latino registered voters seems to be about where it was back in 2016. So there has not been a decline. In fact, one of the notable things you might have seen some stories about are that Latinos and Black Americans are two groups where Trump has made some inroads, interestingly enough, since 2016. But where among Latinos has that happened? It's happened with Hispanic men. So you're seeing Hispanic men are more likely today than in 2016 to say they support Donald Trump. There's the story, of course, of Cubans and also Venezuelans in Florida. But that continued support for Trump is likely not just alone being driven by Cuban and Venezuelans in Florida. They're not large enough as groups to account for this this continued support. But it might also be, as I was talking about earlier, third generation Hispanics in places like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and California, who are also not majority for Donald Trump, but just enough to be able to indicate that the support at least is staying level. And another group, evangelical Christians, who about half of whom say that they support Donald Trump in this election. So when you're talking about the Latino electorate, it is very diverse, and these are just some examples of how it's diverse. Not everybody's a Democrat. Not everybody even thinks that undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay in the country. There is a diversity of viewpoints on just about every issue, even if the majority tend to be leaning towards the positions and viewpoints of the Democratic Party.
I want to say, Bianca, what happens here, at least, it's what I have noticed, is that it has not, it's not related to COVID. It's related to being conservative. It's related to same-sex marriage, and it's related to abortion more than anything. So those conservative traits are absolutely making a dent. They cannot fathom the idea of, I mean, some very conservative and very Catholic Latinos will never, I mean, or at least not up until now, embrace anything like same-sex marriage or abortion. Those are the two topics that I sense completely every day, day in and day out, on the 2-hour morning show, on radio, people call in, and just today, we had on the radio, one of these guys reading passages from the Bible, telling me the horrors about same-sex marriage. And, you know, I mean, I was like, all right, when is this passage over? Because he continued to read from the Bible. That's where you see it.
Can I add two comments here? Because I think what you've just said is really important to note how different the Latino population is compared to other populations. On abortion, Latinos are about split among adults, whether they support it being legal or illegal in all or most cases. Interestingly, that number hasn't changed over the last 10, 15 years we've been doing polling and Pew Research, whereas the US public has become more in support of making abortion at least legal in some cases. On the side of same-sex marriage, there has been movement with Latinos becoming more like the US public on this view, but Latinos continue to lag the US public in the share that say they support same-sex marriage, or who say that, for example, homosexuality should be accepted in the country. So it is notable that Latinos on these two cultural issues haven't quite moved the same way the US public has over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, but the US public has become more supportive of same-sex marriage, for example.
I would just add there's a great resource, the Hispanic Republican Geraldo Cadava's book, the historian. We interviewed him for our film, and I think he provides a really valuable context about that durable percentage of Latino and Hispanic support for Republican candidates, regardless of who they are. I do think the national media was somewhat surprised by the durability of that Latino support, given this administration's anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy. But as Hugo Mark was pointing out, you know, the growing numbers of Latinos are further and further from that immigrant experience. And then I think it helps account for why some Latinos do not feel necessarily attacked in the way that more recent immigrants are.
I think also in addition to the evangelical and the intergeneration and some of the other drivers, you know, Republicans and Trump they've done a good job scaring the hell out of Latinos in terms of this communism or the socialism. And if there's anything you know about either Cuban or Venezolano or Nicaraguenses and people who come with their home country experiences, you know, communism and socialism, and the people who migrated here with those experiences, they'll speak very passionately about, you know, they're being victimized by that, or why they left, or why this country and the freedom in this country that are forced. So without people pushing back on that, and that, you know, Biden or the Democratic Party are not communists or not socialists, if there's no people, there's not a group pushing back on that, that narrative kind of wins the day. And then it becomes like a kind of echo chamber. And I know with recent journalist coverage and articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about disinformation, Spanish language disinformation, not being counteracted as much as disinformation in English language. And some would argue we're not doing that great of a job counteracting disinformation in English, but in Spanish, it's really like everything from communism to socialist to brujeria to anything you could paint, you know, and to scare Latinos, it's all up for grabs now. And then you have really, you know, endearing caricatures, right? I mean, Nodding Lady, the lady who was nodding, who was on Saturday Night Live. Like, how cool is that you could get to Saturday Night Live for being a lady who's nodding in agreement? Mayra Jolie, una dominicana from Florida, immigration attorney, but she's a Trump supporter, and she was nodding behind, you know, and you know, so, and then the Proud Boys international chairman, you know, Enrique Tario, you have these figures that, like, you know, get elevated and get amplified, and you know, and you can't underestimate the you know, how many more people they represent. So while they might look caricatured for us, and while we might not understand it, or we might even think it's self-hating, or we come to our own conclusions, they really kind of have a lot more people behind them that they kind of reflect, if not represent.
This is really sort of more anecdotal based on what I've seen on the ground in Texas, but conjoined with that moving away from being first generation, there also is sort of a suburbanization going on of third generation Latino voters, and I think for a variety of reasons that's also associated with a slight shift to the right and on a number of issues, fiscal issues as well as maybe social issues. But like with the inner city, at least here in most big Texas regions, it's still 80, 90% Democratic, even though arguably probably the Catholic beliefs are more strongly rooted in those communities. But then when you get out to the suburban areas, and it's like third generation Latinos, I think you see a lot more concern about property taxes. That's one reason city property taxes in Texas are really high, and that's one reason that people move out to the suburbs, is to avoid those. So I think there is sort of an interesting correlation there, and maybe even something just in terms of being further spread out and sort of collectivist versus individualist identity, that it's shifts somewhat to the right in those communities.
Vincent?
Hi guys. So again, thank you for being here, and I'm glad that we have another fellow Texan here, Joaquin. My question is really following up on Aldrin's point about disinformation in Spanish news. So like many Spanish-speaking Latinos, I grew up watching Univision and Telemundo, and our families always watch for the news. However, there's been a feeling, and I feel like this is coming more from the younger generations, the millennial, the Gen Z, the Gen X, that the Spanish language news sometimes is a little too sensational and less straight factual. You mentioned the brujeria. I remember, my mom would see, creo que Al Rojo Vivo or something like that, and there would be stories that just seemed like they weren't as much news as they were, a fun story that could be on the front of National Enquirer. How can we as upcoming journalists make sure that Spanish news is not only more accessible to people, but also, more focused on just facts and really giving out the information that really needs to come out to the public, whether or not they can vote, they really need this information.
I think I have to address that one.
Of course. Thank you, Gabriela.
Well, first off, Al Rojo Vivo was not a news show, Vincent.
Unfortunately, some Spanish speakers will take that as news, and it's not, you're right, it's not news, it's sensational TV.
Yeah, and that was the whole thing. It's like getting Alarma, right? I buy the Alarma newspaper, what am I gonna get, And that's for starters. Then the other thing is, I think that the idea that Spanish-speaking news is not accurate and sensational has more to do with the nature of our culture. We've been always addressed like we're this people that dress loud, and we are loud, and we make a party out of anything, and at the same time we are very dramatic, and look at me how I'm talking. So that actually is telling you exactly what I'm saying. So yeah, there is this conception that Latinos will do that to begin with. And then I think that you would add to that the fact that a lot of people have actually said that we are that way, and our president too, to begin with, from the very beginning, he targeted our news anchor, and he immediately said, "You sit down." And the guy said, "I'm not sitting down. And how do you stand up to the president? Why don't you follow his rules? Sit down." That kind of thing. He stood up to him, and that immediately made him a target, and the entire Univision, Telemundo, and the entire crowd of Spanish-speaking journalists went behind that, and goodbye with it all. And then everybody else in the media was targeted as well. We're all fake news unless we say what he says. So that's the reality that we're living. I mean, either you line up with him or you're fake news. to begin with. So that on one end. And on the other side, I would also like to address the fact that Univision has always, and we always were very neutral. It's only, I don't know, maybe I want to say a little bit before the last election, when Univision actually allowed for you to say your opinion. Your opinion doesn't count as a journalist. How many times are we going to say this as journalists, right? But then something started shifting, and it was actually the public who started asking us, the Latinos living in this country, asking us, so where do you stand? Why are you not saying that you're with me? Right? Because either you're with me or you're against me. And when the whole divide started happening, Univision also took a position. Why? Because we're immigrants. We're a lot of immigrants. We're Afro-Latinos. We're Mexicanos. We're people from Honduras, and we're not murderers, and we're not this, and we're not that. So we were forced to take a position. So yeah, the whole shift about making the news media again being perceived as we are all neutral, I don't know how far out in the future it can be again, because at this point in time, as I said at the beginning, the whole conception of mass media has changed. So I don't really know if we're gonna go back to that. I don't know if there's anybody here who knows more about really communications philosophy, or I mean, my next Humberto Eco will tell me, where are we going with this? I mean, what are we gonna be doing as journalists, as you wanna become, Vincent, as everybody else want to continue in this business? Or are we gonna rely on anybody with a phone? Is that gonna be the journalist of the day? The journalist of the jour? Yeah, could possibly be. And everybody has an opinion.
No,
Yeah, Vincent, I think it's I think you asked a really important question. And I think from my view, working in the field, there's an opportunity for younger journalists to build out a new model of either Spanish language media or, coverage of the Latinx community. So I do think, I typically work for public media make documentaries for PBS, although I also do work for the for-profit outlets like ESPN and HBO and others. But I would say that I think there is a gap or kind of a failure on the public media side to better cover the Latinx community. I think we're beginning to see that. This year has seen some interesting programs generated by Latinx makers. There was a great frontline this year about farm workers in COVID. Another partnership with the Associated Press that was looking at younger minors and workers. So I think there are opportunities, but I do think we're going to need to push harder to create a better and more sophisticated programming, especially for younger audiences. I think there's a space there where that can happen. And I would be very excited to see that.
I really appreciate, both of you talking, especially because Gabriela mentions, that this neutrality thing, it's shifting, that we are not always as neutral as we used to be. And I think that as students, that's what we've been learning, that we have to be neutral, that there is no other option but that neutrality. But a lot of us are coming from a background where we've never been able to be neutral in our lives, because that means that we don't always stand up for ourselves. And so it's really good to see these perspectives of like, yes, we can build on that. There is space for us, but we might be able to express our opinions in between that as well.
Thank you. Is there another question from anyone on NAHJ?
May I ask one more question?
Of course.
I know Latinos, are projected to be the largest eligible block of non-white voters this year. But what I want to know is there's enough candidates to represent them.
So Latinos could be represented in a number of ways. Do you mean represented by Latinos?
Yeah, Latinos, or even like political decisions to support them.
It's there certainly has been an increase in the number of Latinos and Latinas elected to public office. So those numbers, and my apologies, my cat's making some noise here. He obviously wants to weigh in, but there's been an increase. In fact, almost a tripling since the 1990s in the number of Latinos elected to public office at all levels. but it is still a very, very small share. It's only about maybe 5% or so of all elected officials at local, state, county, and at the federal level. But I also wonder sometimes, does the representation of a group need to be necessarily done by somebody who's of that background? That's another question. So if there are Latino districts who elect non-Latinos, that may say something about who might be able to represent their interests. I wish I had more data. I don't have more data. Others might have data that they could point to, but those are just some basic facts from the National Association of Latino Elected Officials.
I think for New York City, for example, as I mentioned earlier, demography is not destiny, right? Just because you may have the numbers doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get the outcome that's going to be reflective of your numbers. But in New York City, Latinos are about 30% of New York City's population, about 1/4% of the eligible voters. And yet we've never had a citywide Latino representative ever in the history of New York City. Other cities and other areas with smaller percentages, both of total population and eligible voters, have. And you think of New York City as the bastion of progressivism and diversity and inclusion. But at the city level, it's curious that we've never had a Latino representative on the citywide level. And when you look, when you dig deeper into that, you'll notice that, for example, we have local forms of government called community boards. And we have 59 community boards in New York City. They deal with like land use and liquor licenses and economic development and education issues. We have 59 in New York City. Out of the 59, not one community board of the 59 has Latino representation commensurate with their numbers in that district. Some are represented by like half as much. So the community is 60% Latino, and the community board is like 30% Latino. And that's a compounded exclusion that doesn't allow Latino communities to benefit from the ancillary benefits of that, because these individuals go on to be representatives in government, representatives for intergovernmental affairs in corporations, policymakers. So the exclusion, you have to work your way back and reverse engineer the different decision points where Latinos are being excluded from the numbers in which are merited just based by the very fact that they're living there, that they have dreams, that they have aspirations, that they have familiares there. And you know, that's the real challenge for us now, right? Not to guarantee the outcome, but to give people the opportunity of access, the opportunity of success, or the opportunity to be represented. And then the outcome is the outcome. But I think that's the real challenge for us, is to reverse engineer all those areas where we're disproportionately invisible, right? We're invisible, but there's areas where we're disproportionately invisible. And when you have communities that are like 60% of something, 70% of something, and then only 10% of that which, you know, is bringing wealth, is bringing education, is bringing health, then you got a real problem with the legitimacy now of these institutions. And I think that's why some Latinos have been disconnected in ways that other communities haven't been so. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for our democracy, is not only how we're growing, right, and we're bigger, but how are we being incorporated into these different democratic institutions on the federal, state, and local level, and then the most local of levels.
So Bianca, we have here in Los Angeles the first female Latina president of city council. So that is really wonderful. And she's doing a great job, super local, raised here, Mexican family. I mean, it can't get more local than she, and she has done a phenomenal job. Nuri Martinez is really, remember that name. I mean, we're really thinking she could become a governor, the first female governor Latina of this state. She is powerful. She's doing a great job. And she is product of a group called HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. They do a phenomenal job really helping these girls join the civil service. I mean, it's just the political arena, and they're doing a great job. And we have many examples of that. So she is one of them.
On that note, actually, what I wanted to ask is that Latinas, as in Latino women, remain underrepresented in the full candidate pools for U.S. House and U.S. Senate. But this year, a record number of Latinas are running for a congressional office. At least 75 are congressional candidates, including 72 Latina candidates for U.S. House and 3 for U.S. Senate, which is 56 more than just 10 years ago in 2010. This is the largest number of Latinas who have run for the House or Senate overall and in both parties in a single election year, which I think is great. What do you think has inspired this pattern, and how do we keep it going?
I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but I think probably one thing is just, viewing recent success and, I think notoriety also. I'm sure, candidates and office holders like AOC, are drawing just a lot of attention to it and making people believe that they can win office for the first time. Also, I'm not sure what the reason behind this is, but sort of locally, one interesting dynamic that I've noticed is that Latina candidates in sort of these down ballot races, like judges and races like that, where there's not much name identity for either candidate, tend to, in Democratic primaries, tend to outperform Latino candidates or, other, in San Antonio, for instance, other candidates. So I'm not sure why there's sort of that generic preference for the Latina candidate. I don't know, Mark, if you have any insight into that.
I'm not a scholar of this enough to be able to say, but I would point to a number of trends that have emerged over the last 20 years, which helped to set us up for where we are today. So for example, young Latinos, they're finishing college at a higher rate than young men, Hispanic men. It's just the gap is getting bigger, and you're seeing about, for example, almost 1 in 4 young Latinos ages 25 to 29 now with a college degree. But this has been happening for a while. So the folks who might be perhaps interested in running and perhaps have a college degree, not that you need to, but that says something about some of the changes that are underway. The other thing is that this is a population that's grown. Back in 2000, there were 35 million Latinos in the US. Today, there's 61, 62 million. Just on that alone, the numbers are going to go up. Even if hardly anybody runs, if you have 60 million, twice as much almost, you're going to have more people running for office. So I don't think we should underestimate that perhaps there isn't some big trend going on. It's really just there's just more people who happen to choose to run. But it also may be that the parties are investing more in trying to raise and create a bench of people who in the future could be those folks who can run for office. Republicans had done this more earlier on with Latinos and Latinas in terms of grooming people at the various levels. And there was oftentimes a conversation of how the Democrats were behind on this. But those things may be changing, and that's what I mean by I may not be enough of an expert to say others maybe can answer this. But I wouldn't underestimate just that the numbers are just there, and that may be why we see so many more people running. So anyway, others might have thoughts.
On the media side, I would just add, piggyback on what Joaquin was saying, that you really can't underestimate the kind of blowout impact that Ocasio-Cortez had on the media landscape. As one small example, the Knock Down the House, the Netflix documentary that highlights AOC's run, sold for $10 million. It was a record at Sundance. It was one of the biggest documentary sales until this last year. So I think that both in terms of demographics, but also not other Latina candidates haven't struck a chord in the same way. As an example, AOC's Democratic challenger, on a Democrat, but to the right, Caruso Cabrera, absolutely failed to kind of pick up the same kind of attention and resonate with folks in AOC's district. So I think there's something about, I hesitate to use the word authentic, but there's something about being unapologetically yourself in a certain way that has worked. And I think, I would say from the media standpoint, I think Latinas are kind of leading in building out that, certainly younger female electeds are doing something that we haven't seen in recent memory in American politics.
Great, thank you so much. We have one more question from a member of the NAHJ, and then we're opening up the Q&A. So once Angie asks her question and it's answered, you can either type in your question in the chat or raise your blue hand and I'll call on you. Angie?
Thank you. This is in reference to the historical background political background for which a lot of Latin Americans come from their countries with. This background of having a lot of dictatorships and a lot of political instability, or being unstable socially and economically, financially. Does the fact, and especially to Bernardo Ruiz with the Latino Vote, the film, you talk about having the engagement on voters or having people to vote actually. Does the fact that most Latin American countries live in political corruption play a key factor in their civic engagement here in the United States when they come and they become citizens and they're able to vote? And how could this be avoided or changed?
It's such a great question, and it's obviously a multifaceted question. So, it requires a multifaceted response. And that's why to take a step back, I think we have to be careful about the way we use that category of Latino, because it means everything and nothing at the same time. And I think that you have had within the United States, obviously, solidarity around certain identities, whether it's the Boricua community here on the East Coast or Texas, the Mexican American and Chicano communities in Texas and other communities. I do think that to your point, your very good point, it's important to think about the history of right-wing fascism in Latin America and the Caribbean as players and influencers. We often talk about the dictatorships of the left, and how that impacts the U.S. vote, but we don't talk about the kind of histories of right-wing dictatorships like in the Southern Cone and in Central America, that also have played a really important role. I think we certainly need more reporting on Central American origin Latinos in this, in the U.S. as well. So I think it's what's tricky about the quote unquote Latino story is that you cannot divorce it from that context. So it is a kind of double duty for those of us who attempt to cover the Latino community in the United States to talk about that history as well. It means that we're also looking at a historical context that's quite complex. I frequently rely on Pew as a resource for many, many reasons, but I do think there's something very interesting about the way that political identities shift and change once you're first generation or second generation in this country. So I think there's always a fascinating tension between recent arrivals from Latin America and the Caribbean and Central America and folks who've laid down roots and have been here for a long time. And I think it's very clear to me in filming in 4 states this year, that there are continued tensions along those lines between those who have a closer connection to the immigrant experience and those who've been here for a longer time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ronaldo, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon and good evening to everyone. So my question is to the panel, and I'm referring here to a text by Frederick Opie on the coalitions between African American and Latino or Latinx organizations throughout U.S. history. And specifically, it's more like it's a 2-part question in the context of whether or not the panel sees the bifurcation of race and ethnicity on the U.S. Census as a way as to allow anti-Blackness to increase within the Latino community, but then also in the context of African American and Latino coalitions. and the austerity measures that we're seeing taking place post-COVID, does the panel see the possibility for an increase or a decrease of the coalition between these two communities?
I think if I could tackle some of it. I mean, the issue of race, right, and as a social construct, for demographers and statisticians, and even for the Census Bureau, it's just so stubbornly, Latinos are stubborn. Like for over 200 years, they've been trying to say, look, you're either white or black, like choose one, or maybe you're Native American. And like the largest category for Latinos is sometimes other as race. So like we're like, this cosmic race of other. But it's caused a lot of issues, right? For solidarity and for coalition building. Because of the very origins of this country in terms of its anti-blackness, and because race is understood so differently in the home countries where people are migrating from. So you can have people who are dark-skinned, a Dominican or dark-skinned Puerto Rican or whatever, and put on a census form that they're white, right? But they don't necessarily mean Anglo-Saxon white. I mean, they certainly don't mean that, but it causes frissions and it causes kind of like divisions when you start speaking about race in that way. And additionally, when you start speaking about class as well, a lot of folks who migrated here from their home countries might have had, their class might have been property owning in their home countries, or their class lens may be very different. So here, while they may be working class, or they may be not with the same status that they had in their home country, their voting or their perspectives almost counter their interests here, right? They vote against their very interests here because they're still using a lens from their home country. And that causes difficulty in trying to build coalitions around a class, right? Around working class identity. So whether it's working class identity, whether it's the formation of Black-Brown coalition and solidarity, it ranges, right, from state to state, because again, as you mentioned, this notion of Latino is kind of like a catch-all category, but it plays out very different whether you're, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexicano, Tejano, Chicano, it just plays out differently. I do think that for a lot of Latinos, they're starting to think like that there's a shortage of allies for Latino causes and Latino issues, when many Latinos feel that they have been there for others, right? That they've been there for other ethnic groups, they've been there for other people in the United States, and there are issues that are really important to us. There's like a shortage of allies. And I think that sometimes that's been brought forth, but I do have to say that when it came to caging the children, right, this issue of caged children, I do have to say that at least in New York City, the African-American community, the Caribbean American community showed a level of allyship, a level of solidarity, a level of stepping up, and the white community as well, that made Latinos feel, I think for the first time in a while, that we have allies. And in certain issues, the narrative, for example, in police brutality, when you look at Latinos who have been a victim of police abuse or police brutality, or stop, question, and frisk in New York City, or racial profiling, we don't necessarily, our journalists or the narrative doesn't necessarily put a Latino face to that. Often it's really African-American narrative, but it affects the Latino community just as much. And sometimes because of language and linguistic isolation, sometimes the abuse to non-English speaking Latinos around policing issues is even more, but the outlet for them to get help or the outlet for them to get their voice heard has additional hurdles and obstacles. And unless we can amplify that, then that whole subgroup of voices never gets heard. So I don't know if that answers the question a bit.
There she is.
I want to just tell you, Reynaldo, real quick. I have been participating with a group that has a brand new entire program. It's called Strength Through Unity. And that is exactly what they're doing. They have put panels together with Latinos and African Americans or Blacks together to talk about precisely about that, and to talk about ways on how to support each other in these times. And I mean, just like really reflecting on what have we done as community, living side by side and being oppressed at the same level. Just to what Aldrin was saying, yeah, I mean, police brutality here is, or police excessive use of force, as I want to call it, has been disproportionately affecting, of course, Latinos and then African Americans. But at this given point in time, Latinos took to the streets as much as African Americans, just to say, you know, if I as Latino don't come out today and support you, you're not going to come out there and support me when I'm screaming out there that my kids are being caged. That was part of the entire messaging that went through and permeated through those days here in Los Angeles and in the entire state of California. And it's still being used today. And as we approach elections, those messages are out there. We are together. We're both being oppressed and targeted. So yeah, it's working.
And just speaking specifically in the voting rights context going into this decennial redistricting cycle, I know that there's far more concerted efforts at coalition building between communities of color and organizations representing them, and a recognition that in past redistricting cycles, the groups in power have really pitted communities of color against each other and sort of tried to, make fights about which group would have a majority Black or majority Latinx district. And I think a real recognition of that and concerted effort to try to come together early to agree on principles and try to build more coalition districts.
Thank you. Eduardo, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me all. Having you all. Sorry, I'm excited to hear from you all. I wanted to. So some of the terms have been getting thrown around, right? The term is Latinx, right? We go Latino, Hispanic. I was kind of curious. I've been looking at a lot of local, Facebook groups, either Republican or Democrat. And I wanted to check with you all about like, how should we be thinking about party identification with, these kind of identifiers versus, ethnicity, and I guess how that factors in voting. I'm just kind of curious in that.
Eduardo, let me make sure I understand your question. So you're wondering what terms you should use to describe, say, Democrats who are of this background? Should you use Latinx, Hispanic, or Latino, Latina? Is that
Sorry,
what you mean?
yeah, thanks. No. How is there any like kind of research or data on that, on how folks who are of Latin American descent are identifying based on party ID and looking at whether they identify themselves as Hispanic or Latino?
There's certainly that's some of the work you can see from the Pew Research Center. But to give you some sense of it, you do see, for example, Latinx tends to be more likely used by people who lean towards the Democratic Party, tend to be younger, tend to be college educated, also frankly tend to be English speaking. And then if you take a look at Republicans, they tend to prefer the term Hispanic over Latino. And Democrats generally prefer Latino over Hispanic. But that is some connection that you will see among the party IDs. But that's a very broad way to think about it. I think you oftentimes need to go place to place and state to state and location to location. These identity terms, these pan-ethnic ones, and use will vary. Like Texas, Hispanic will be much more popular both among Democrats and Republicans than it will be, say, in a state like California, where Latino and Latina and Latinx tends to be more popular. In New York City, it'll be different from Florida. that's my read of it in doing focus groups around the country, that oftentimes you just got to ask people what they want as opposed to trying to apply a label to folks. But I know that's, it's hard to talk about a group without having a label for it. But our work has shown that most folks have no preference for any of these terms. And if they did, Hispanic is oftentimes nationally the term that's preferred by far over all these other terms we're talking about.
I would just add that as a journalist, it's often a fraught choice. I had, you who are journalists or journalists in training will probably find this funny, but we had endless editorial conversations with our executive producers about what term to use in our text cards of the documentary. So the concern was that if we used Latinx, which as Pew has pointed out, like, what is it, 3% of the population acknowledges using it, or that it becomes then a political choice. What you choose, what term you choose to frame. So as a journalist, if you're attempting to create an inclusive portrait and say this is a portrait of a diverse community as a whole, it can become fraught which language use. We actually did something in the open to the documentary, which is in the open text card. We actually cycle through the terms. So we say Hispanic, Latinx, and Latino as a way to show that these terms are a reflection of political perspectives, and there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the way that people talk about themselves.
Yeah, I find myself switching a lot based on the different contexts. So like in a court case, say on redistricting or something, you're dealing with census data. So you're sort of naturally talking about Hispanic voting age population because that's how it's reported from the census. So, I think we all pretty much end up saying Hispanic in like court filings and that sort of thing. But then if, I'm talking to like a youth voter registration group, I would end up using Latinx or something like that.
Thank you. Arlene, would you like to ask your question?
Let me unmute myself. First, let me say how much I've enjoyed the conversation, and a big shout out to Aldrin. We know each other from Community Board 12 where I served. I survived, I made it through, but I just wanted to say I am a young journalist who remembers Walter Mercado. And I highly recommend the documentary that recently came out. It is phenomenal. But I have a question about telling stories. I am not Latina. I'm a New Yorker, so I feel like I have absorbed a little bit of everyone and everything from growing up here and being born in the Bronx and raised in Brooklyn. But my question is, who gets to tell everyone else's story? I happen to like other people's backgrounds, heritage, history, but how seriously will I be taken? I'll be in the Bronx tomorrow. I suggested it. Why not? Covering the elections, the early voting. So it's sort of a very broad question and also a very specific question. Who gets to tell each other's stories? And I have to say, for one, if someone wanted to cover the Holocaust, be my guest. Like, I feel like that's a great, I feel it because I am Jewish, culturally, fine. If you can tell that story and do it well, like, I'm open to it. I don't know if everybody else is, but I am. So who owns your story? I'm putting myself on mute.
I'll just jump in with a brief comment, and I think, Arlene, you're bringing up a conversation that's happening. We're having a robust debate in the documentary world, that intersection of journalism and documentary about precisely this question. Who gets to tell whose story? And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for anyone. What I'm interested in as someone who has sat on funding panels from Sundance to foundation panels to ITVS, which is the largest funder of public television documentaries. I think historically we haven't seen younger filmmakers of color, have the ability to tell their stories. And I think what would be exciting is to have more of these makers or journalist storytellers get at some of the nuance and culture. And I always think about a comment that Spike Lee made about a decade and a half ago. And he said, you know, what would be The Godfather without an Italian-American director who could get at some of that cultural nuance? So it's not that someone from an outsider community shouldn't make a story. It's just what happens. Can there be some magic or some additional insight when someone is from the community and can get at something new or fresh, which might be enlightening to an audience? So I think that's the question. I think with anytime any of us tackles a story is what expertise or additional insight do I bring to the table? And I think, you know, that's a question worth asking for any story.
Can I add something here? Because this is a really interesting question, which is something that comes up oftentimes in a research framework as well. Who should be writing about or doing surveys of Latinos, for example? Can anybody do it? And, you know, being in the research world, it really has been interesting and striking to me that sometimes some folks will say, oh, we just need somebody who has the expertise in that skill, but anybody can learn about the Black American, Latino American, Asian American population and eventually write about it or do research on it. I'm not so sure I agree. I do think that the cultural competence that comes with having grown up or been a part of it, of the community, is important for even shaping how you do research questions and the way you ask them, to frame them, and so forth. And I sometimes say that even an editorial decision to have a report that focuses on the story of one group, oftentimes written by people of that group, can be quite powerful. I don't want to be an advocate because I can't be an advocate in the work that we do at Pew Research, but I would say that that's one of the challenges I've found in the research world is this tension between, can anybody do the work on this, or is it somebody who has to be of the background?
You know what, for me, it is, I would second what Mark says. I'm born and raised in Mexico. I studied in Mexico, and I'm a journalist in the United States, and I serve the Hispanic community. So having said all that, I have to tell you that our newsroom has a lot of people. It's composed of a lot of people that come from various backgrounds. But there is something to be said about somebody who knows the little quirks and things about the Hispanic community. I am not going to say that somebody else that was raised in Mexico cannot actually get that, even if the family came from, I don't know, somewhere else in the world. But I have to say that there is some kind of something that I cannot do that a Puerto Rican can do when they're talking about hurricanes. It's just like I try, but I've never lived it like them when they were little. That kind of thing, I will say. Also, it's like as a storyteller, when you are talking about the way things smell and taste and feel, there is something of a remembrance there. I do believe people can get that skill, and I know. I mean, what did you like best, Coco or Book of Life? Right? Who did a better job telling you the story of the Day of the Dead? Who got more views? Who got more the message out of what really the Day of the Dead means? Disney or El Señor del Toro? I mean, you know, that's where I'm going. It's like you can do a great job, and yeah, if you can team up with somebody else who has that feeling for it, you're golden.
Yeah, and I would just say too, just because one is Latino or identifies as Latino does not mean that that person, that journalist or storyteller, has automatic insight into the community they're covering. I mean, as we've been discussing throughout this whole conversation, you know, there's a vast difference between someone who's arrived with immigration status, a white-skinned person or a light-skinned person, versus someone who's had a vastly different experience. So simply being from a culture or from a country does not provide you with automatic insight. So I think it's important to complicate that idea. And at the end of the day, when it comes to storytelling, there are many ways in which we can connect to stories. So, you know, Arlene, if you're a New Yorker, that's, you know New York. So that's the insight, additional insight you have. You know, some of us who cover specific communities or are from certain communities can add additional nuance. And I think I think it's important to acknowledge that because that has typically been overlooked in the past by editors and executive producers.
Thank you all so much. So because we're almost at 5:30 Eastern, there are 2 more questions. In order to preserve time, I think that maybe I will call on Ronaldo and Eduardo together, and then they can both ask, and then you can answer sort of both, if that makes sense.
No question for me. This is Eduardo. No.
Oh, just kidding. So, Ronaldo?
Yes, sure. So my first question is a follow-up to Aldrin's intervention in the context of criminal justice. No, I think that there's an elephant in the room in the narrative on the domestic level when it comes to criminal justice and the invisibility of Latinos. Obviously, given the death or the murder of George Floyd, but then not so much later, that same week, Andres Guardado was killed in LA by the sheriff department. So my question is to the panel, given how you're engaged in both the English and Latin Spanish realm of the dominant means of communication, is how do we propose identifying the need to go beyond the black and white binary in a way that includes other communities, especially the Latinos, given the invisibility that I see as to our people in criminal justice, but then also speaking to other communities, such as the indigenous, who, if you look at them per capita, are facing the highest level of killings and murders and police brutality. So I'd like to see how the panel can provide some insight on that dynamic, because I quite frankly see it that our communities are used to achieve elected office, but then we're simply discarded until the next electoral cycle comes to the forefront.
I think, I know I see others wanting to weigh in as well. So I just briefly just say that, I mean, for Latinos, right, and we already spoke how we're not monolithic and it's geographic specific, it's intergenerationally nuanced. But, you know, there's always the concern that to get beyond this black-white binary, we're not being used as a wedge. Mm-hmm. We're not politically being used as a wedge. Our attempts to get beyond these race constructs are not because we want to erase the white supremacist origins, right, of the United States, or we want to hide the anti-blackness that's very much institutionalized and systemic, right? So I think that often, you know, the difficulty in getting the broader conversation of moving beyond the white-black binary and engaging in these issues more nuanced and more authentically in terms of Latinos and the roles we could play, sometimes has been hampered because they've been framed as kind of like us not picking sides or being told that we've picked one side over the other. And I think that's really what's kind of stopped some conversation and dialogues in many ways, because, and quite frankly, some people do want to get beyond the black-white issue because they want to be a wedge, right? Because they want to exacerbate, you know, one side over another, or they want to deny anti-blackness, or they want to, you know, so that's also been a reality. There's been a cottage industry, I would say, of Latinos in certain media networks and in certain other areas who have been particularly used in a way to divide and to kind of like ignore the trajectory of this country's history in terms of, you know, slavery and the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, the women's movement. You know, you have some Latinos out there saying some pretty wild things and being used as a wedge and politicizing, you know, this race issue in that way. So I think people are very sensitive to that. Renato, I don't know if that makes sense or answered your question somewhat.
It did somewhat, but you know, and that second question I phrased or posed is particularly, you know, following up the first one, given the history of the grassroots movement across the U.S. and then the relationship between grassroots movement and then elected political office, starting from the very bottom all the way to the top. No, as you know, in New York City right now, we have a current mayoral candidate who's looking to possibly bridge the gap between Latinos or Latinx and African Americans. But the reality is, you know, there is a dominant narrative to paint the social ills of this society simply within this black and white paradigm or dogmatic paradigm that doesn't give us the stage to be able to depict the intensity of the Latinx realities. And if the dominant forms of communication is the media, then the question there is, what's not being told and how do we break into that narrative?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but I think one, when you're talking about maybe the stories that are not being told on a broader scale, I think about the intersection of the criminal justice system and the immigration enforcement and deportation. And that for whatever reason, I think the bulk of or much of reporting tends to view those as two separate issues, as opposed to looking at the areas where there's actually they're very similar policies and approaches, and what many organizers and activists view as a kind of institutional racism. So I think there's some really interesting reporting going on at that intersection. And I think to me, that's one very specific place where investigative journalists and reporters can look at where issues, where some potential issues and areas of solidarity exist, and also where we just simply need more attention because it's unclear what's happening in those areas. And we're just beginning to see the kind of fruits of years of investigative reporting about the family separation issue. And so I think looking at where criminal justice intersects and immigration policy intersects, I think is a fascinating and critical area that I think we need more media attention on.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're unable to take any more questions because we've actually now run over time. But thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here today. You were incredible, and I learned so much. I think everyone probably did. And for students and people who attended, please let us know if you would like more conversations like this by coming to our meetings or emailing us, and we'll make sure to make them happen on Zoom campus for now. We'll do Zoom claps. Thank you so much. And everyone have a wonderful night and weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.